Three best friends bound by trust and love went camping on Santa Island, but only one returned. What began as a joyful 3-day escape turned into a nightmare that haunted their families for over a decade. Sophia Jones, Emily Parker, and Abigail Morgan had spent months planning it. Their lives had grown busier, adulthood tugging them in different directions. Careers, relationships, responsibilities. But this was their chance to press pause, to reclaim the carefree joy of being young, together, and free. Santa Island was the chosen destination. Just a ferry ride from the mainland, the island was famous for its untouched woods, glittering shoreline, and trails that promised adventure without the noise of civilization. It was quiet there, beautifully so. Too quiet, some said. Sophia Jones was the firebrand of the group, the one who insisted on planning every detail down to the camp menu. At 25, she carried her late father's charisma and her mother Linda's resilience. Ambition burned in her like a steady flame, but beneath the bravado, she still carried the ache of growing up with just one parent. This trip, she had told Emily and Abigail, was not just a getaway. It was a celebration of their bond, of survival, of friendship. Emily Parker was 26, her eyes soft with the glow of recent engagement. She carried a warmth that made people lean into her presence, a natural nurturer who always thought of others before herself. Her fiancé had been hesitant about her going, half joking that he didn't want her getting eaten by mosquitoes. But Emily had laughed it off. She needed this, one last adventure before stepping fully into the new chapter of her life. And then there was Abigail Morgan, spirited, fearless, and always hungry for the unknown. Her steady relationship back home was a comforting anchor, but her soul yearned for exploration. To her, Santa Island was a playground waiting to be discovered. She promised her mom, Helen, that she'd bring back dozens of stories and maybe even shells from the shore, if they weren't all stolen by the seagulls first. Their mothers, Linda, Margaret, and Helen, watched them leave with smiles. The three women had been childhood friends themselves, bonded by summers in Yosemite when the world seemed simpler. To them, watching their daughters grow into women and still hold on to each other was a blessing. It was like looking at a mirror of their own youth, though they never imagined how fragile that reflection could be. The first day on Santa Island was painted in joy. The girls set up their camp near the tree line, close enough to hear the hush of the waves but sheltered by tall pines that reached into the sky. They cooked marshmallows over the fire, told stories that had been told 100 times before, and laughed until their stomachs hurt. Their phones buzzed with messages, Mom's checking in, Sophia's co-workers teasing her about escaping, Emily's fiancé sending heart emojis, Abigail's boyfriend asking if she had remembered her hiking boots. Everything was light, ordinary, safe. Day 2 brought adventure. They hiked deeper into the forest, Emily carefully marking their path with ribbon, while Sophia teased her about acting like a camp counselor. Abigail wandered ahead, calling back to them every few minutes, her voice echoing between the trees. They found a small stream that shimmered under the afternoon sun and spent hours dipping their feet in the water, their laughter mingling with the sound of rushing current. By the evening, they were tired but glowing. They sent photos back home, selfies with the backdrop of green wilderness, a shot of Emily pretending to trip on the trail, a candid of Sophia sipping from her water bottle, and Abigail grinning with both arms stretched to the sky as though she were trying to hold the entire forest. Their mothers received those pictures with quiet pride, replying with heart emojis and reminders to stay safe. On the third day, they decided to explore closer to the shoreline. Abigail, ever adventurous, led the way. They collected smooth stones and driftwood, competing over who found the coolest piece. Sophia stopped now and then to take in the horizon, the vastness of the ocean reminding her how small she was, how fleeting everything could be. Emily, in her nurturing way, made sure they were all drinking enough water, adjusting Abigail's hat when the sun got too bright. That night, they built their biggest fire yet. The stars spilled across the sky in endless constellations, a sight so breathtaking that Emily whispered it looked like a ceiling painted by angels. Sophia recorded the moment in her journal, her way of keeping memories tangible, while Abigail danced barefoot in the sand, humming songs that drifted into the night. It was supposed to be their last night on the island. They promised themselves they'd come back again, maybe even bring their mothers one day for a second-generation reunion. Emily spoke of her wedding plans, the dress she'd found, the song she wanted to dance to. Sophia teased her but secretly loved every detail, imagining herself giving a speech at the reception. Abigail talked about a road trip she wanted to take across the country, just to see if I can touch every ocean in a single year. And then came the silence. The morning of the fourth day, their mothers tried calling. Linda Jones dialed Sophia first, eager to hear about their ferry ride home. No answer. She frowned but brushed it off. Maybe they were packing, or maybe her daughter had forgotten to charge her phone. Margaret Parker tried next, dialing Emily as she prepped her lesson plans for the week. The phone rang and rang, then clicked to voicemail. She told herself Emily might be too busy taking one last set of photos before leaving. Helen Morgan reached for her phone, hoping to hear Abigail's laugh on the other end. When the call went unanswered, she pressed redial, twice, then 3 times, her heart beginning to pound in a rhythm she couldn't explain. By the time evening rolled in, all 3 mothers had tried again and again. The silence was deafening. There were no photo updates, no texts, no cheerful "we're on our way back." Linda stared at her phone long after the screen went dark, her widow's heart already bracing for a loss she prayed wasn't coming. Margaret set her lesson plans aside, unable to focus, pacing the length of her living room until her knees ached. Helen stepped outside her shop, gazing at the horizon, as though searching for a sign across the miles that separated her from her daughter. By the 5th morning, the weight of silence had become unbearable. 3 days had passed since the last calls, since the last photos, since the last proof of life. The ferry that should have brought their daughters back to the mainland had docked and departed again without them. Linda Jones was the first to break. She sat at her kitchen table, Sophia's empty coffee mug still in the sink, staring at her phone with red-rimmed eyes. She had always prided herself on raising Sophia with strength, telling her she could survive anything, just as she had after her husband's death. But strength didn't explain this silence. Something was wrong. Margaret Parker, normally composed and level-headed from years of teaching restless students, had stopped eating altogether. Her fiancé had called, frantic because Emily hadn't answered him either. Margaret tried to soothe him, but her voice cracked under the weight of her own fear. Helen Morgan was pacing outside her shop, keys jangling in her hand. Her adventurous Abigail never stayed quiet this long. Even on her wildest trips, she sent at least a single text, a breadcrumb of reassurance. Now there was nothing but the void. By noon, the 3 mothers were on the road. The decision was unspoken, almost instinctual. Childhood friends bound by decades of trust, they didn't need to argue. They loaded into Linda's SUV, their faces pale and resolute. Santa Island was only a few hours away, but each mile stretched like a lifetime. The drive was heavy with silence. Every now and then, Helen would whisper a prayer under her breath, her fingers twisting around the small cross that dangled from her neck. Margaret stared out the window, tears slipping down her cheeks as images of Emily's laughter and wedding dress fittings flickered in her mind. Linda kept her eyes locked on the road, jaw clenched, refusing to let her hands shake on the wheel. Santa Island greeted them with a false cheer. The ferry landing bustled with tourists lugging coolers and backpacks, oblivious to the storm of dread carried by the 3 women. The air smelled of salt and sunscreen, seagulls cawed overhead, and children tugged on their parents' arms. But for Linda, Margaret, and Helen, every smile felt like a cruel contrast to their unraveling world. They made their way to the camp office, a building with maps pinned to the walls and brochures scattered across the counter. Behind the desk, a young woman with sunburned cheeks greeted them with cheer. "Can I help you?" It was Margaret who spoke first, her voice brittle. "Our daughters came here to camp. They should have checked out by now, but they haven't come home." The staff member tapped at a computer, scrolling. "Names: Sophia Jones, Emily Parker. Abigail Morgan, Linda said quickly, leaning forward. The girl's brow furrowed, then softened into a smile. Oh yes, I see them here. They checked out on the morning of the 4th. Everything seemed fine. Bags packed, all smiles. I remember because I thought they were such a sweet group. They even joked about coming back next summer. For a moment, the mothers stood frozen. Relief might have been expected, but instead a deeper dread took root. The idea that their daughters had walked away, laughing, only to vanish into silence, it didn't make sense. Checked out. Helen's voice cracked. Where did they go? Did they say where they were headed? The girl shook her head. No, but they seemed happy. I'm sure they're fine. Maybe they decided to stay with friends before heading home. The dismissiveness in her tone stung. Linda's hand trembled as she gripped the counter. You don't understand. They're not answering. None of them. Something is wrong. The girl shifted uncomfortably. I'm sorry, but if they left the campgrounds, it's not really something we track. Outside, the air felt colder despite the sun. The mothers sat in the SUV without speaking for a long moment. The image of their daughters smiling and leaving clashed violently with the silence that followed. Each of them clung to memories of the last phone calls, the last texts, the last proof of connection. Something was missing, something unseen. The drive back to the mainland was different from the drive there. No whispered prayers, no attempts at comfort. Just the sound of the tires against the road and the occasional sob breaking through. Margaret pressed her sleeve to her mouth to stifle her weeping. Helen clutched her phone, redialing Abigail over and over, listening to the hollow ring that never connected. Linda's eyes blurred with tears, but she refused to pull over. By the time they reached Yosemite, the mothers knew what had to be done. The weight of their instincts was too heavy to ignore. They walked into the police station together, their faces drawn and resolute. At the front desk, Linda spoke with a trembling voice. We need to file a missing persons report. The officer asked routine questions. When had they last been in contact? What were their daughters' ages? Were there any signs of trouble? The mothers answered in unison, each word laced with desperation. They showed the photos sent from Santa Island. Smiles by the campfire, arms around each other, the kind of images that should have reassured but now only deepened the sense of loss. The officer took down notes and promised to forward the case to Santa Island's local authorities. Since the last place they were seen was there, the island police will take primary jurisdiction, he explained. That night, back in their homes, the mothers sat awake in separate rooms but with the same haunting thought. Their daughters had vanished between the moment they smiled at the camp office and the silence that followed. Linda replayed Sophia's last laugh in her head like a recording she couldn't turn off. Margaret stared at Emily's engagement ring, still sitting in a dish by the kitchen sink where she'd taken it off before the trip, promising to keep it safe. Helen held Abigail's childhood stuffed rabbit against her chest, whispering that she would find her no matter what it took. The missing persons reports were filed, but the days that followed blurred together in a haze of sleepless nights, unanswered questions, and growing fear. Police reports were filed, flyers distributed, and pleas made on social media. Yet the silence deepened. Every hour that passed without word from Sophia, Emily, or Abigail felt like another nail sealing the coffin of hope. By the 7th day, Santa Island was no longer just a vacation spot. It had become the center of a mystery that gripped the community. Search parties combed the highways leading off the ferry docks. Police officers checked every rental lot, every parking garage, every stretch of shoulder where a broken-down car might sit abandoned. Volunteers walked through wooded areas with flashlights, calling the girls' names until their voices cracked. Nothing. The ferry logs confirmed what the camp office had reported. The 3 young women had boarded a boat back to the mainland on the morning of the 4th day. The staff remembered them smiling, their bags slung over their shoulders, blending in with the stream of other campers heading home. Somewhere between that dock and their homes, they had disappeared. But there was no abandoned car waiting in a lot. No luggage. No scattered phones. No signs of struggle along the highways. By the 10th day, the story had broken into the news cycle. Local reporters set up outside the Santa Island ferry terminal, broadcasting live with somber expressions. 3 young women, gone without a trace. Families desperate for answers. The photos of Sophia, Emily, and Abigail flashed on television screens. Smiling, full of life, contrasted against footage of their weeping mothers clinging to one another during interviews. Linda Jones appeared on camera, her voice raw. If anyone saw anything at all, please come forward. We just want our girls home. Margaret Parker spoke next, hands trembling as she clutched Emily's engagement photo. She was supposed to be married this year. Someone out there knows something. Helen Morgan, exhausted but fierce, glared into the camera lens. Abigail doesn't just vanish. She fights. If she's out there, she's fighting. But she can't do it alone. Help us. Tips poured in, sightings of young women matching their descriptions in truck stops, diners, and bus stations. Police chased each lead, but everyone fizzled into disappointment. By the 12th day, the weight of dread had nearly crushed the families. The mothers met daily, their bond the only thing keeping them upright. They cried together, prayed together, and sat in agonizing silence together. Then came the 13th day. It was early evening when the knock came at Linda Jones's door. She rose from her armchair, bone stiff with fatigue, expecting a neighbor or perhaps another officer with bad news. But when she opened the door, the world shifted. There stood Sophia. She was thinner, her cheeks hollowed and streaked with dirt. Her hair was tangled, her clothes torn, her lips cracked from dehydration. Her hands shook as though every nerve in her body had been stretched to breaking. "Mom!" Her voice cracked, hoarse and broken. "It's me." Linda's scream was part disbelief, part relief, part agony. She pulled her daughter into her arms, collapsing to the floor with her, sobbing into her hair. "Sophia, my baby, oh God, my baby. Where have you been? What happened? Where are Emily and Abigail?" Sophia's body convulsed with tremors. Her eyes darted around the room as if even the shadows might betray her. When she finally spoke, her words came in fragments. "They took us. After camp. Men in a van. They forced us inside. They blindfolded us. I don't know where they took us. Days, maybe. We tried to fight. Emily, Abigail." Her breath caught on a sob. "They shot them. When they resisted, I ran. I just ran. I didn't stop until I found a road." Linda's heart fractured. She held her daughter tighter, torn between the relief of her return and the horror of her story. News of Sophia's reappearance spread faster than wildfire. By morning, the house was surrounded by police cars, reporters, and neighbors. Cameras flashed as Sophia, wrapped in a blanket, was escorted to an ambulance for medical evaluation. The crowd's cheers of relief were choked by the weight of her confession. 2 girls still missing, presumed dead. Margaret and Helen rushed to Linda's side, their faces pale with grief. They clung to Sophia, begging for details, for reassurance, for some sliver of hope that Emily and Abigail might still be alive. But Sophia only shook her head, tears streaking down her face. "They didn't make it," she whispered. The official statements came quickly. Law enforcement labeled the case an abduction that had ended in double murder. Search teams shifted from rescue to recovery, scouring backroads, abandoned cabins, and riverbanks for any trace of Emily and Abigail. Their mothers clung to denial, unable to accept finality without bodies. But deep down, they felt the truth seeping in. The community mourned as though it were their own daughters who had been lost. Candlelight vigils filled church steps. Strangers left flowers at the family's doors. Social media turned into a storm of outrage, grief, and fear. "How could 3 girls vanish in broad daylight?" people demanded. And who was behind it? For Linda, relief and devastation clashed in her chest. She had Sophia back, but the cost was unbearable. Margaret and Helen envied her miracle even as they held her hand through tears. They wanted their daughters too, even if it meant hearing the worst. Sophia remained fragile, a trembling ghost of the vibrant young woman who had left for Santa Island. She spent hours staring out the window, refusing food, shuddering whenever she heard the slam of a car door or the flicker of a shadow across the wall. When asked for more details, she would recoil, her eyes darting with panic. The 13th day marked both an end and a beginning. The mystery of the disappearance had broken open into horror, but it was far from over. One daughter had returned, carrying a story of abduction and murder. Two were gone, their voices silenced forever, or so it seemed. Sophia Jones sat hunched in a chair at the police station, wrapped in a blanket that seemed too thin to protect her from the chill of memory. Her skin was pale, lips cracked, her eyes restless, darting to corners as if expecting shadows to peel themselves from the walls. The officers around her softened their tones, careful not to push too hard, yet the room throbbed with urgency. Everyone wanted answers. "Start from the beginning," one detective said gently. "Tell us what happened after you left the camp." Her hands twisted in her lap, fingernails digging crescents into her skin. "We walked to the ferry. It was normal. We were laughing." Her voice faltered. "Then a van. It pulled up when we got off. Men with masks. Guns. They forced us inside before we could scream." Linda, sitting only a few feet away, gripped the edge of her chair. Each word from her daughter cut into her heart like glass. She wanted to rush forward, to hold her, to shield her from the memory, but she forced herself to stay seated, to let Sophia speak. "They tied our hands, blindfolded us. I couldn't see where they were taking us, only that the ride was long." Sophia's voice dropped to a whisper. "When they stopped, they dragged us into a barn. Dirt floor. The smell of hay and oil. We were shoved into corners, tied to posts. They threatened us." Her breath came in ragged gasps. The detective slid a bottle of water toward her, but Sophia didn't touch it. "They kept saying we shouldn't scream, shouldn't resist. They said they'd let us go if we stayed quiet." Her body shook, as though the words themselves carried the weight of terror. "But Emily, she begged them to let us call our families. Abigail cursed at them, said people would come looking. That's when—" She stopped, covering her mouth with trembling hands. Tears poured freely now. "They shot them. Right there. I heard the gunshots, the screams, and then nothing." The room stilled. Even seasoned officers lowered their eyes, shaken by the rawness in her tone. "How did you get away?" another detective asked softly. "I don't know." Her shoulders slumped. One of them stepped out. "Maybe for a smoke. The rope around my wrists was loose. Maybe because I fought against it all night. I slipped out. I ran. I ran until my lungs burned, until I hit a road. I hid until a truck came. I don't even remember how I got home." She collapsed into sobs, rocking in the chair. Linda rushed forward then, rules forgotten, wrapping her arms around her daughter. "You're safe now. You're safe," she whispered. The police wrote everything down, pressed for more, landmarks, sounds, any detail that could pinpoint the location. But Sophia shook her head again and again. "I don't know. I couldn't see. It was all blindfolds and voices." Outside the station, the world was already calling her a miracle. News crews swarmed the steps, microphones ready. The survivor of the Santa Island abduction. The lone girl who had made it home when the others hadn't. On television, Sophia's image replayed, wrapped in a blanket, eyes glassy, voice trembling as she described narrowly escaping death. Anchors spoke with reverence, headlines splashed across screens, "The girl who survived." Viewers wept, strangers lit candles, and thousands flooded social media with messages of support. To the public, Sophia was hope incarnate, proof that even in the darkest nightmare, survival was possible. But behind the closed doors of her home, Linda saw the cracks others missed. She saw how Sophia flinched at sudden noises, how she refused to sleep in her own bed, instead curling up on the living room couch with the lights on. She noticed the way her daughter avoided certain questions, how she deflected when memories cut too close. Relief filled Linda's heart every time she looked at Sophia, but unease gnawed at her too. Investigators began their own search, fueled by Sophia's testimony. They scoured rural barns within a 100-mile radius, knocking on doors, sending cadaver dogs into fields and forests. They combed backroads for tire tracks, streams for discarded weapons, ditches for any trace of Emily and Abigail. But nothing surfaced. No blood. No shell casings. No barn matching Sophia's descriptions. No bodies. It was as if Emily Parker and Abigail Morgan had not just been murdered but erased. Weeks passed, and the investigation slowed, though the grief did not. Margaret and Helen clung to Sophia's account, because it was all they had. Yet both mothers wrestled with torment, mourning their daughters without graves, aching for closure they could not find. At vigils, Sophia stood beside them, a fragile figure trembling in the candlelight, her survival both a comfort and a wound. People called her brave, blessed, chosen. But when the crowds dispersed, she often stood apart, staring at the ground as though wishing it would swallow her whole. Linda watched it all unfold with conflicted eyes. She thanked God for her daughter's return, yet questions kept her awake at night. How had Sophia truly escaped? Why was there no trace of the barn, the men, or the crime? And why, when she thought no one was looking, did Sophia sometimes stare into the distance with an expression that chilled her mother to the bone? An expression not of fear, but of something darker. Sophia was home. That much was true. But whether the nightmare had ended, or was only beginning, remained to be seen. For 12 long years, the story of Santa Island lingered like a wound that refused to heal. Sophia Jones, now in her late 30s, carried the invisible scar of being known everywhere as the survivor. To neighbors, co-workers, and strangers, she was the living proof of resilience. But for her, the label was heavy. Each time someone whispered her name with reverence, it dragged her back to that night when Emily and Abigail never came home. Emily Morgan's family kept her bedroom untouched, the pink curtains washed and rehung every season, her journals lined neatly on the desk. Her mother would sit in that room late at night, reading entries until her eyes blurred with tears. Abigail's parents moved away from Santa Island, but not before building a shrine of framed photographs in their new home. Their hope was dim but stubborn, like a candle burning at the edge of a storm. The investigation had long gone cold. Detectives retired, files were boxed and pushed into the recesses of evidence rooms, and Santa Island became just another town with another mystery. The unanswered questions haunted everyone who remembered. Why Sophia? Why only her? Then, one gray October afternoon, the silence broke. Inside the small, weathered police station of Santa Island, a man walked in, his steps slow and deliberate, as though each one carried the weight of decades. His name was Victor Hale. At 57, his once broad shoulders had withered, his face carved by time and illness. He leaned heavily on the counter, asking to speak to a detective. When he had the chance to speak with one, he spoke without hesitation. His voice was gravelly but steady. "My name is Victor Hale. I used to be a criminal. I did many wrong things in my life. But now I have nothing to lose." The officers exchanged wary glances, unsure where this confession was headed. Victor went on, "I've been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. It's spread. The doctors said I have less than 3 months to live. I've given my life to Christ, and I can't meet my Maker with blood on my hands." He paused, coughing into his fist. When he looked up, there was a fire of something, regret, desperation, or perhaps a final grasp at peace. I have committed numerous crimes, too numerous to count, including the popular case of the 3 girls that went missing on Santa Island. The room stiffened. The case had been frozen in silence for more than a decade. Victor continued. Back then, I ran with a gang, 4 of us. We pulled jobs, smuggling, intimidation, petty to dangerous. That night, we were hired to do something. Pick up 3 girls, scare them, make sure they disappeared for a while. We didn't ask why. We just did the job. The detectives leaned forward. 3 girls? One of them asked carefully. Victor nodded. Yes. The 3 girls that were declared missing in Santa Island about 11 or 12 years ago. A hush fell over the room. The only sound was the scratching of pen on paper as one officer documented every word. Victor's eyes dimmed with something heavier than guilt. But here's the truth no one ever thought to ask. It wasn't random. It wasn't us choosing them. The job came from inside. He leaned closer to the table. It came from one of the girls, the one named Sophia. The detectives froze, pens halting mid-stroke. What are you saying? I'm saying Sophia orchestrated the kidnapping, Victor rasped. She wanted those girls gone. She made contact with us through someone we trusted, paid us, promised us there'd be no consequences, said she'd act like a victim, and we'd make it look convincing. The room erupted in disbelief. One officer slammed his hand on the table. You expect us to believe the only survivor set it all up? Victor didn't flinch. Believe me, I'm a dying man. I have no reason to lie. He pulled a crumpled notebook from his coat pocket, sliding it across the table. Inside were names of old associates, places they had used as hideouts, and even a sketch of the barn described years earlier by Sophia. This is what I remember. If you look hard enough, you'll find traces. I can't prove every detail, but I can give you a start. Detectives rushed to verify. Calls were made, files reopened, DNA samples compared. Every lead pointed back to connections Victor claimed, and though much was lost to time, the consistency of his story was impossible to ignore. Within days, the Santa Island police issued a warrant. Sophia Jones was arrested in her modest suburban home, her face pale as blue and red lights flashed across her living room. Neighbors watched from behind curtains, whispering in disbelief. The girl they once called a miracle was now being led away in handcuffs. The island was thrown into chaos. The survivor had become the suspect. Families of Emily and Abigail wept, torn between vindication and devastation. All these years, Abigail's mother sobbed into cameras, we lit candles for her, prayed for her healing, while she may have been the reason my daughter never came home. For the first time in over a decade, the case had a pulse again. But it left a darker, more chilling question hanging in the air. What kind of secret could make a friend orchestrate the disappearance of her own? And if Victor Hale was telling the truth, what exactly had Sophia gained by surviving? The Santa Island tragedy was no longer an unsolved mystery. It was a storm breaking open, threatening to shatter everything people thought they knew. Sophia Jones sat at the steel table of the interrogation room, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her once carefully curated image as the girl who survived seemed to cling to her like a final shield. Across from her, detectives shuffled papers, their faces unreadable, waiting for the moment to strike. I don't know this man, Sophia said firmly, her tone bordering on defiance. Victor? Whoever he is, he's lying. I've never seen him before in my life. Her voice carried the weight of a woman who had told her version of the story so many times that she nearly believed it herself. For 12 years, she had been the victim, the lone girl who made it out alive. Now, her entire identity was being called into question, and she refused to let it crumble. But the detectives weren't convinced. They slid a photograph across the table, a mugshot of Victor Hale from years earlier, his eyes cold and calculating, his jaw square. You're saying you don't know him? He says you orchestrated the whole thing, one detective pressed. Sophia's fingers curled into fists. Why would I? They were my best friends. Emily and Abigail meant everything to me. Why would I hurt them? The air in the room was tense, the kind that thickens with every word. But the officers had planned their next move carefully. They wanted to see her reaction when she came face to face with the man who had shattered her carefully built narrative. Moments later, Victor Hale was escorted in, handcuffed, his frame frail but his presence commanding. He was dying, yet his eyes carried a cruel clarity. The moment Sophia saw him, her mask cracked ever so slightly. Her lips trembled, her gaze darted away, her breath shallow. Victor said faintly, "Hello, Sophia." Her silence betrayed her. Victor sat opposite her, leaning forward, his voice low but sharp enough to pierce through the walls she had built. "You thought you could bury it. You thought we'd all disappear. But I'm still here, and I've got nothing left to lose." Sophia shook her head, whispering almost to herself, "No, you're making this up." But Victor didn't stop. His voice carried the weight of memory and accusation. "You were jealous. Don't deny it." Emily, engaged, glowing, a future ahead of her. Abigail, so sure of herself, in love, full of life. And you, alone, always the one left behind. He let the words sink in. You hated it. Hated being the shadow in your own circle. Tears welled in Sophia's eyes, though she fought them back with a clenched jaw. "You paid us," Victor continued. "Paid us to make sure they didn't come home. You wanted to be the last one standing. You said you'd play the victim, that we should rough you up a little, tie you down, but leave you alive. And the others?" He stared straight into her. "You told us to kill them." Sophia's body jolted as if struck. She slammed her hands on the table. "That's not true," she screamed, her voice cracking under the weight of emotion. "I didn't. I would never." But the dam had broken. The detectives could see it in her trembling, in the way her voice faltered at the edges. Victor had pierced her armor. He pressed harder. "You wanted sympathy. You wanted the world to see you, to finally care about you. You thought if you were the survivor, you'd be special." Sophia's breathing became ragged. The room spun around her. Memories flashed. Emily's laughter, Abigail's smile, the sickly thrill of her secret plan. She had buried it deep, but Victor's words unearthed it like a corpse clawing its way to the surface. Finally, with tears streaming down her face, Sophia broke. Her voice was soft at first, then shattered into sobs. "I didn't mean for it to go that far. I wanted them gone. I was tired of being nothing, of always being the one left out." Her words tumbled, raw and desperate. "I told them where to meet. I led them into the trap. And I told you to make it look real, to make me a victim too. But Emily, Abigail, they weren't supposed to," she choked, burying her face in her hands. The detectives sat in stunned silence, their pens still. The survivor of Santa Island, the girl who had carried the sympathy of a nation, had confessed to orchestrating the murder of her own best friends. Her sobs echoed through the room, a twisted symphony of guilt and relief. Sophia Jones, the miracle girl, was now the architect of the tragedy that had haunted the island for over a decade. The trial of Sophia Jones began on a gray Monday morning, a chill settling over Santa Island that seemed to echo the gravity of what was about to unfold. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered with signs and cameras, some holding photos of Emily Parker and Abigail Morgan, the two young women who never came home. To the public, this trial wasn't just about justice for them. It was about unmasking a betrayal so deep that it had scarred an entire community. Inside the courtroom, Sophia sat at the defense table, her once confident demeanor gone. The world now saw her not as the fragile survivor who had endured unthinkable trauma, but as the architect of a nightmare. Her dark hair hung loose around her face, her eyes hollow from sleepless nights. Behind her, her mother Linda sat stiffly, torn between two unbearable truths: the love she held for her only daughter, and the horror of the crime Sophia had admitted to. The prosecutors wasted no time in building their case. They painted Sophia as cold, calculating, and driven by envy that had festered for years. They called her the mastermind, the one who had turned friendship into a weapon. In measured, relentless tones, they walked the jury through Sophia's carefully constructed facade of victimhood. Her fake escape story, her trembling TV interviews, her lies that misled police and tormented grieving families for over a decade. She was not the victim, the lead prosecutor declared, his voice rising. She was the villain. This was no act of desperation. This was jealousy. Jealousy that burned so deep she was willing to destroy the lives of the very women who called her their sister. They replayed clips of Victor Hale's confession, juxtaposed with Sophia's own breakdown during interrogation. They showed photographs of the three girls smiling at the campsite, oblivious to the betrayal that awaited them. Each piece of evidence added to the weight pressing down on the courtroom. The defense, however, painted a very different picture. They didn't deny that Sophia had played a role, but they argued she was unstable, pressured by criminals, and manipulated into actions she couldn't control. They described her as a lonely young woman whose mind was fragile, whose yearning for belonging and recognition had been twisted by the wrong people at the wrong time. She was not a monster, her defense attorney pleaded. She was a broken young woman, vulnerable, isolated, and desperate. Did she make terrible choices? Yes. But should her entire life be defined by a single collapse into darkness? We ask you to consider not just what she did, but why she did it. Sophia sat quietly through it all, her hands clasped, her face pale. When she did speak, briefly, softly, it was to apologize. I wish I could undo it. I loved them. I loved them, even though I didn't know how to show it. I was wrong. I was weak. Her voice cracked, but the courtroom was unmoved. For Linda, her mother, every day of the trial was a torment. She sat behind her daughter, often clutching a rosary, her eyes filling with tears. She had raised Sophia alone after her husband's death, pouring every ounce of her strength into keeping her daughter safe. And now she sat helpless as that same daughter unraveled before her eyes. Some nights she convinced herself Sophia was still the victim of circumstance, while on others she admitted in the quiet of her heart that the prosecutors were right. The trial stretched for weeks, each day heavier than the last. Finally, the case was handed to the jury. The waiting was unbearable. For 3 days, the courthouse was silent but for the clicking of reporters' keyboards and the restless pacing of families in the hallways. On the 4th day, the jury returned. The courtroom filled to capacity. Reporters, grieving families, townspeople who had followed the story for years. Sophia was led in, her wrists in cuffs, her face streaked with exhaustion. Linda gripped the edge of her seat so tightly her knuckles turned white. The foreman stood, holding the paper with the jury's decision. The silence was deafening. On the charge of conspiracy to commit kidnapping, guilty. Sophia closed her eyes. On the charge of murder in the first degree, guilty. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Linda gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The judge nodded solemnly, his face grave. Sophia Jones, this court finds you guilty on all charges. For the crime of orchestrating the kidnapping and murder of Emily Parker and Abigail Morgan, you are thereby sentenced to death by hanging. Gasps filled the courtroom, followed by silence as the weight of the verdict sank in. Sophia broke then, sobbing uncontrollably as deputies moved to escort her away. She turned toward her mother, her eyes pleading. "Mom, please. I'm sorry." Her voice cracked, desperate, but Linda could only stare, her own tears falling, unable to reconcile the child she raised with the woman condemned before her. The judge, his voice stern and deliberate, delivered one final warning as order was restored. Let the record also reflect that 3 members of the kidnapping gang remain at large. This court urges law enforcement to continue their pursuit of justice. This story does not end here. As Sophia was led away, her cries echoing down the hall, the families of Emily and Abigail wept quietly. Justice had been delivered, but no verdict could ever bring their daughters back. Linda remained seated long after the courtroom emptied, staring at the space where her daughter had sat. She was a mother torn in two, watching her only child disappear into a darkness from which she would never return. Victor Hale's sentencing took place just weeks after Sophia's trial. By then, he was already a shadow of the man he once was, his body gaunt, his steps unsteady as guards escorted him into the courtroom. The diagnosis of late-stage pancreatic cancer had left him with less than 3 months to live, and he seemed to wither before the public's eyes. Despite his failing health, the judge did not lessen the weight of justice. For your role in the kidnapping and deaths of Emily Parker and Abigail Morgan, this court sentences you to life in prison, the judge declared. Victor nodded, almost relieved, as though the punishment was the final penance he had been waiting for. His confession had unmasked the truth, but it had also sealed his fate. He would not leave prison alive. True to the doctor's predictions, Victor lasted just 3 weeks and 4 days behind bars. He passed quietly in his sleep, his name etched forever into the island's bloody history. Some saw his death as an end, others as too merciful for the pain he had caused. Meanwhile, the families of Emily and Abigail tried to piece together something resembling closure. On a crisp autumn morning, their mothers, Margaret Parker and Helen Morgan, stood side by side at a newly erected memorial stone on Santa Island. The granite marker bore the engraved names of their daughters, along with the simple words, "Forever loved, never forgotten." They brought bouquets of flowers, Emily's mother with lilies, and Abigail's mother with sunflowers, the ones her daughter always tucked into her journals. Together, they knelt at the stone, whispering prayers and laying the blooms gently against its base. A few feet away sat Linda Jones, Sophia's mother. She hadn't brought flowers. She hadn't joined the other mothers. Instead, she sat alone on a weathered bench, her face etched with exhaustion and grief. To the community, she was a figure caught between worlds, a mother who had lost her daughter not to death, but to the weight of her daughter's crimes. Linda's heart was torn apart. She loved Sophia. How could she not? Yet she could not deny the horror of what her daughter had done. She watched Margaret and Helen honor their daughters, and guilt twisted deep within her. Sophia had betrayed them, and Linda carried the shame as if it were her own. For the townspeople, however, the long nightmare of Santa Island had reached its conclusion. The mystery that had haunted them for over a decade was finally laid to rest. No more unanswered questions. No more speculation about the missing girls. Justice had been served. As the sun set behind the trees, casting the island in shades of gold and crimson, the community breathed a collective sigh of relief. The case that once seemed endless had found its close, though the scars it left behind would remain forever. Emily and Abigail were gone, Sophia awaited execution, and Victor Hale lay buried in an unmarked grave. Yet on that evening, with flowers laid at a stone and tears mingling with prayers, Santa Island found something it had not felt in 12 years: peace.